So yes, welcome everybody. And apologies actually for those who might have already attended our first session last week. There will be a little bit of a repetition at the beginning, but I've tried to keep that to the minimum. So my name is Nina Schonberg, and I am the coordinator for the Nature Recovery Networks project these webinars are a part of. We had, like I said, one session already last week, which was really aimed to introduce us all to the concept of ecological networks and nature recovery networks. And we were especially looking at sort of overall setup of initiatives and especially initiatives that might have been running a little bit longer. For these other two sessions then, we'll be looking at the sort of crucial delivery mechanisms in a bit more detail, and today's focus obviously being on policy and planning in particular. And then next week at our last session, we will be looking at mapping. Hold on, there's a bit of a lag apparently for me to get to the next slide. There we go. So as always, there's going to be a little bit of housekeeping before we get started with the interesting stuff. Obviously, apart from the three talks that we've got scheduled today, we have the Q&A at the end as well. And we've also got a couple of polls that we will be launching throughout today. And what we really hope that these polls will help us to do is to learn from you in the audience and what you consider to be important in terms of successfully delivering nature recovery networks. So do please respond to them, because it will be really interesting for us to learn from you, and it's all anonymous as well. I have also gone rather adventurous, and I'm going to try in a couple of slides time to use Slido, which I will talk you all through when we get to it. In case it doesn't work, we'll just pretend that never happened. But again, it would be quite a nice way of us learning from you in the audience. In terms of the setup today, obviously we are using the Zoom's webinar setup, and that means that the hosts and the presenters will have the ability to have their cameras and mics on, but not everybody else in the audience. I do apologize for this, but we have quite a few people. I think we've got over 60 people now on the call. It's unfortunately not really practical to bring attendees individually onto the screen during the Q&A, or to have breakout rooms and so on, because we do want your full attention for the whole session today. But I do encourage you to utilize the chat. And in case you are using the chat, do make sure that you are making your comments to all of the attendees or just the panelists. Just be aware that there's that functionality of directing your questions. So make sure to direct it to who you want that to be directed to. So obviously in the chat, you can chat amongst yourselves, share links and so on. And in case you have any trouble, we obviously have Laura and Monica, my brilliant co-hosts behind the scenes. So if you have any trouble, just use the raise hands functionality and they will do their best to give you a hand. When it then comes to the actual Q&A and posing those questions to our speakers, do not use the chat function, but instead please use the Q&A functionality. So we've got a bit of a separation with them. Again, with the number of you in attendance today, there is a chance that we won't be able to go through all of the questions. So for that, please do use the thumbs up functionality to upvote the questions that you are finding most important, and that will then help us to prioritize with the questions that I will be putting forward to the panelists during the Q&A at the end. We are recording the sessions and we'll be sharing them with the public on a later date. So if you do have any concerns around this, do get in touch with me. You will find my contact details on the slide at the end of the day. In case we do have any people who are tweeting, Please do use the hashtag NatureCoveryNetworksNI and tag us at NRN_NI into the tweets. It would be nice to follow up on those. I'm sure Catherine will also mention this herself, but we do have some sensitivity around her contact in terms of her presentation. So please don't take any pictures of her presentation. We might, in fact, end up excluding the portion of the recording as well before we put that on towards the public. So I would recommend paying extra attention basically to her presentation, because this might be the last time you will see it. So why are we talking about nature covering networks as a concept in the first place? It's probably not news to anyone in the audience today that our wildlife and our natural environment are at a crisis point, and this is largely driven by long-term habitat loss and fragmentation, in addition to other pressures, obviously, such as pollution and climate change. To put this into context, the 2019 State of Nature report stated that Northern Ireland is the 12th worst in the world when it comes to biodiversity loss. And obviously with this in mind, there's quite a compelling case to be made to rethink really how we would like to, or how we should look after our environment going forward. Obviously, this sort of thinking really stems from the understanding of the interconnectedness and distribution of metapopulations, and more widely, the network of ecosystems really across the wider landscape. And that really supports the need for what has since been called ecological networks. Fundamentally, ecological networks as a concept really represents a culmination of an array of insights towards addressing conservation needs effectively, and in particular where critical areas are being protected. Biodiversity is being looked after at a landscape or at least a regional scale, with emphasis really on ecological coherence, and especially through delivering connectivity between habitat patches, but also making sure that these critical areas for biodiversity are being buffered from the effects of damaging external activities. So I guess what the key here is really is working towards a network of ecologically important areas that are functionally and not just structurally connected. While some countries, such as the Netherlands, from who we heard from at our last session, work has officially been ongoing as far back as from the 1990s. In the UK, it's only in the last couple of years that this sort of thinking has started to gain wide-scale momentum, but also policy support. And this has largely really been driven, this landmark report from 2010 called Making Space for Nature, which was produced by Sir Lawton and his colleagues. And this really put in black and white how the current approach towards looking after our environment just isn't enough, and highlighting the need to bring about bigger, better, more and more connected habitats, these being the Lawton principles that some of you might have heard of. Beyond this as well, the last decade has brought further sort of evolution on this thinking beyond purely looking at the ecological benefits of these habitats, and highlighting that while there's a primary role of supporting biodiversity, there should also be opportunities that should be taken to highlight the joint benefits for people as well, in shape of what we call ecosystem services. And these include the likes of flood alleviation, recreational opportunities, climate change adaptation and mitigation, and so on. And this is what we now call ecological networks, and why we have adopted this as a working concept for this project. If you'd like to look into what has taken place globally, there's a very useful review paper that came out a couple of years ago, which we will be linking in the chat. This looked at the last 30 years of planning ecological networks globally. If we look at Europe quickly, obviously for relevant contexts, it really has started from the EU Habitats Directive, and thus the network of Natura 2000 sites. But beyond this, There's also been transnational initiatives that have taken place, such as the European Green Belt and the Pan-European Ecological Network initiative. And these have taken place in the past. And in fact, a recommendation coming out from this PEN exercise was the establishment of national ecological networks, which is now reflected in the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030, which does make reference to building this coherent trans-European nature network stemming from these national level policies and delivery. In terms of the project that we are running at the moment and why we're here today, since September last year, so 2020, together with RSPB, Ulster Wildlife, National Trust and Woodland Trust, in the spirit of the Landscape Conservation Partnership, and generous funding from Lottery Heritage Fund, we have been running this capacity building project exploring what nature recovery networks as a concept could do for us here in Northern Ireland. As part of the project, we will be conducting a national scale mapping exercise in order to increase our understanding on what our current land cover is like, but also to highlight where there's potential for enhancing the existing network of habitats and sites. And beyond this, we'll obviously be exploring appropriate policy avenues as well for delivery of this sort of thinking. And we'll be advocating for this to be adopted into practice. And obviously, this is exactly why we are here today. Especially in the light of what's taken place in the last over a year now, with COVID and Brexit, and with policy avenues we currently have available to influence here in Northern Ireland, post-CAP agri-environment support, the Environment and Nature Restoration Private Members Bill, just to name a few. We have an extremely unique opportunity at hand here in Northern Ireland to really evaluate what we would like to have our future approach to environmental governance to look like. If we want to build up back better, how do we also ensure that this includes greener and not obviously forgetting just the interlinking to dealing with other major issues such as climate change? We obviously have great building blocks towards this with DRS Green Growth Strategy and the £2 million Green Recovery Fund that was recently allocated for Northern Ireland by the Department of Finance. But obviously we need to use this opportunity strategically. Obviously 2021 also launched the UN Decade of Restoration. We have COP15, COP26, and we're also hosting the G7 presidency this year in terms of UK. So we do really have a great opportunity to utilize this momentum and this platform as part of which Northern Ireland could showcase that it's putting its long-term well-being and both of its environment and its people into the forefront of their future. And we do believe that nature recovery network as a concept could play a key role in facilitating this sort of thinking, especially by acting as a mechanism to integrate nature and nature-based solutions effectively across our governance system. While obviously this is a huge challenge, it's not simple. If we were to really look at this as a problem and not as a problem, but rather as a solution, and ensure that we really did our homework and we would be smart about it, I think it really is possible, especially in the context of Northern Ireland being quite small. And obviously we've got the fortune of learning from others as part of this. So for today, really, we need to do our own thinking, like I said, when it comes to what this all could, but most importantly should look like for us in practice. So as part of today's session, we will be exploring the different delivery mechanisms that could play a role in bringing about nature recovery networks here in Northern Ireland, especially when it comes to policy, strategic planning, and if we think about the role of planning in delivery as well. We're obviously very grateful that we have our presenters here today who've been willing to give us their time and been willing to be asked questions as well, which is fantastic. So thank you already in advance. And obviously, like I said, it's a great opportunity for us to learn from them and to ask questions. So do use that opportunity. So I did touch upon wanting to trial something that is called Slido. So what I've done is I've prepared us all this Slido link. So what this basically allows us to do, fingers crossed, is in real time to showcase your responses to this question that we have on the screen. So there's 3 ways of doing this. In case you have a smartphone, you can simply use your camera on your phone and read the QR code, which will give you then the link you can follow to Slido. Alternatively, Laura and Monica will be giving you a link in the chat that you can follow with your computer. Or thirdly, you can simply go to slido.com, and there's a box at the top of that page where you can put this code NRN_NI in, which will allow you to do exactly that. So basically, I've put a question up there, which is, what do you consider to be the key mechanisms to successfully deliver nature recovery networks in Northern Ireland? And as an example, these could be particular primary or secondary legislation, or they could be key stakeholders. So we'll give this a couple of minutes. And obviously, you might learn that if we have people giving the same responses, the text will get bigger on the screen. And what we'll also do, that we'll leave this live until, let's say, an hour after this whole session, just so throughout the day, you can keep on adding responses to it as well. So long-term funding very much being highlighted as a key legislation, working in partnership, working together collaboratively. Oh, this is great. Looking at things long term. The fantastic thing, obviously, is that we'll get a record of all this so we can have a look at these afterwards. Co-design, buy-in, engaging with community and the other important stakeholders, data. Oh, this is excellent. I think we have a few more responses still coming in, so we'll give it a few moments before we jump into our first presentation. I'm delighted that this is working, because it was a little bit of a question mark of how well this would work. So I do hope that there's nobody who's struggling. But like I said, we'll leave this open until an hour after the session. So if you have any ideas during today's sessions, or even after, have a light bulb moment, you can still keep on adding to this. Fantastic. I think we'll go on so we can get going to the really interesting bits, so our talks. So I'll leave this on while I do my intro to our first speaker. So our first speaker is Dr. Catherine Daigan, and she is the Special Projects Manager and co-lead at the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, so JNCC's policy and advice team. And she's currently on secondment from Natural Resources Wales. Since having completed her PhD in zooplankton in Irish lakes, on Irish lakes, Catherine has built a career based on the provisioning of environmental evidence and advice using her in-depth knowledge of environmental management in the UK and beyond. Her scientific publications include a number of papers in Welsh protected areas, the current UK lake classification, and a book on the rivers of Wales. At Natural Resources Wales, she led a group of technical specialists covering marine, terrestrial, and freshwater environments. She's also a former council member of the Freshwater Biological Association. Catherine also has a keen interest in culture and heritage, and she's the trustee of the National Museum Wales, the Welsh pronunciation of which I do not dare to attempt. So I will stop my screen sharing and give
Thank you very much, Nina.
to Catherine.
And we will see if we can get the show on the road here. So can you see anything yet?
Yes, I can. We can see our notes section though, so it's not on the presenter mode yet.
So my magic F5 button is not working now.
We did trial this and it worked too well, didn't it?
It did.
Will you be able to see your...
How about that?
That looks good at our end.
Yes, you can just see my slides, not my notes. Yep. So we're in business here. Yes. Thank you very much, Nina, for that introduction. Good morning, everybody. Diadich Golair. I'm speaking to you from the island of Anglesey, North Wales today, but I grew up in County Offaly, surrounded by some of the best raised bogs in the world. So it's a very special treat for me to contribute to a meeting in Ireland or Northern Ireland today. I hope to set foot on the island of Ireland again soon. This review of terrestrial nature networks in the UK is very much a joint effort with colleagues in the country nature conservation bodies in the UK. And they're listed here on my introductory slide. So I have had input from Natural Resources Wales, Nature Scot, Natural England, and the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland. It builds on a JNCC-led workshop and presentation which we put together for the Festival Ecology organised by the British Ecological Society before Christmas. And the main objective of my talk is to provide you with an overview of the progress made with network development, mainly in Wales, Scotland and England, supported by publicly available sources of information. As Nina said at the start, there's a little bit of sensitivity here in Wales at the moment because we're in a pre-election period. So I'd be grateful if you did not tweet any of my slides or refer to the talk today on social media. We hope this information will be useful for consideration of the next steps in Northern Ireland. And I've had some specific input from Richard Whale, who should be in the audience today from a Northern Ireland perspective. And it's important that you appreciate that I'm not going to try to represent the position or interests of any particular country, but they have supplied information that they are happy to share with you today. Nina and her team will add the relevant links to the chat box as we work our way through the presentation, so be ready to click. And I hope that those links will serve as a very good record of the talk if we decide not to publish the recording later. For those of you who do not know JNCC, we are the public body that advises the UK government and devolved administrations on all aspects of UK-wide and international nature conservation. So JNCC offers a space for the countries to come to work together. And we work with a wide variety of partners, from government, academia, to the research organisations and to NGO communities. And we've produced a new strategy available on our website, which focuses on environmental status, supporting environmental decision-making, international action and offshore management. In March of last year, our strong culture of collaboration across the UK allowed us to bring together the key individuals to carry out this review, cited at the bottom slide, of terrestrial nature networks in the UK. Again, you can find the workshop report on the JNCC website. And there's also a full list of contacts in JNCC. Nina will add the link. Currently, JNCC is building links with the countries in the UK, including the establishment of a series of liaison posts, which will be part of the Nature Conservation Policy and Advice team. Again, a relevant link will be added to the chat box. Across the UK, ecosystems face a common set of large-scale environmental pressures, leading to habitat degradation and fragmentation. They include climate change, pollution, agriculture and fisheries management, and urbanisation. And following the English landmark Making Space for Nature report led by Professor Sir John Lawton in 2010, the development of nature networks became widely recognised as a means to support environmental resilience in a changing world. He challenged us to make our protected areas more joined up, bigger and better. So 10 years later, a review of nature recovery networks seemed timely in the context of the current interest in developing new UK land management schemes post-EU membership and in terms of preparation for COP26. To create a network represents a potentially unique UK-scale nature-based solution towards mitigating biodiversity loss and climate change. We began our review by summarising the main legislative and policy drivers for networks across the UK. In Wales and England, the separate Environment Acts in place and pending at the time provide the key legislative foundations with additional support from the Resilient Wales goal in the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in Wales. Where country-specific acts are relatively less developed, the focus is on continued international commitments and national and more local plans, policies and strategies. Nature networks have a growing prominence in the UK as a means of addressing the biodiversity crisis and supporting climate change, adaptation and mitigation. For example, the vision by 2045 of the Environment Strategy for Scotland is, by restoring nature and ending Scotland's contribution to climate change, our country is transformed for the better, helping to secure the well-being of our people and planet for generations to come. More recently, the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change and Land Reform launched the government's Biodiversity Statement of Intent on the 14th of December 2020 for Scotland, highlighting in the statement is an indication of the role of ecological networks in the new Scottish Environment Strategy, which will be published 12 months after COP15. It says, our new strategy for biodiversity will highlight the need to facilitate the creation of new, locally driven projects such as Cairngorms Connect, which aim to improve ecological connectivity across Scotland. So, in general, there is a common UK policy theme around leaving our environment in a better state for future generations. Again, check the annex in the JNCC workshop report, which has a very good summary across the UK for nature networks, policies, plans and strategies. So I'm grateful to Richard for this specific content on Northern Ireland. Improving nature recovery networks in Northern Ireland is what Northern Ireland has been doing for some time now, though daily work and actions may have not always recognised that. It's been an overarching theme to the general direction of travel. NIEA's strategic priorities for running from 2012 to 2022 has two relevant priorities worth highlighting. Resilient and diverse ecosystems underpin economic and social health by providing valuable service such as clean water. And secondly, realizing the full value of our natural and historic environment in all decisions is the key to long-term prosperity. Bigger, better, more joined up has been the impetus for many grant-funded projects, including CAN and CAB and the Bug Life Beelines project, Woodland Trust, Lough Neagh Partnership, and others, including agri-environment schemes and those related to small woodland creation. So much of the Northern Ireland environment policy is now due for review, so it's a good time to embed nature recovery networks. And of course, today's programme is funded by the HLF project, so this is all very timely. However, the UK picture is a complex mix of legislation, strategies and plans in relation to nature recovery networks. Again, check the annex in the JNCC report for the overview. Our review documented a shared policy ambition, individually held by Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland, to create networks with a strong focus on developing ecological resilience. It was evident that networks will be a key future conservation planning mechanism for both nature and landscape conservation, and they will address commitments to the international, at an international UK and country level. At the moment, there are opportunities to develop them associated with agri-environment, forestry and habitat restoration schemes, and a lot of other operational areas. Private investment in natural capital is also likely to be a key mechanism for network delivery because the project scale is large enough to unlock this type of investment. In some countries, nature networks have been defined in government policy, and here's an example from Wales. Within Wales, there is a focus on having resilient networks as defined here. So networks of habitat in good ecological condition, joining up designated sites and other biodiversity hotspots to provide maximum benefits for biodiversity and our well-being. Resilience is the capacity of ecosystems to deal with disturbances, either by resisting them, recovering from them, or adapting to them, whilst retaining their ability to deliver services and benefits now and in the future. In addition, the attributes of resilience, which are listed here, diversity, connectivity, extent, condition, strongly reflect the original Lawton Challenge. And we can look at diversity from different angles, such as natural diversity, with a key role for protected areas, but also to increase structural diversity at different scales and to diversify productive systems. A network should seek to maintain the extent of existing habitat and to restore and create semi-natural habitats. There would be an objective to get protected sites and wider habitats into good environmental condition, to advocate good management generally, and to improve the condition of soil, air and water quality. And the final obvious attribute of connectivity relates to maintaining and enhancing the network and to improve or reinstate connective features. And when I look at a map like this as a freshwater ecologist, I can see rivers in the South Wales valleys. Rivers are clearly key connecting habitats, and their restoration will be an important contribution to network development. The characteristics of resilience are the foundations of a larger, what's called a DECA framework shown here, and they are considered measurable. Together, diversity, extent, condition and conductivity generate emergent properties of an ecosystem, such as its adaptability, recovery and resistance to disturbance, with the final overall resilience on an ecosystem emerging, but not directly measurable. So important point here is that these ecosystem attributes are the most easily measurable characteristics. Again, we'll add some links here to guidance documentation around this. But have a look at the State of Natural Resources report on the Natural Resources Wales website if you want to see how this framework is applied to make judgments about ecosystems. It's fair to say that the UK is at a nature network implementation phase, and their development is dependent on the involvement of people. Nature networks are about people as much as nature, especially local communities who have their own sense of place and vision for the environment. And guidance is being produced to empower these communities, including principles of network design, focused on creating and improving sites, joining them up, building resilience through the restoration of natural processes and incorporation of diversity, and monitoring progress. I'd highly recommend this Nature Networks Evidence Handbook produced by Natural England. A recipe for success model is being used in Scotland, and again, it promotes engaging, planning, doing, evaluating, and sustaining. So please have a look at that, track down that Natural England report. Bringing these principles together with those put forward by Lawton, we can think of a continuum of conservation approaches and practical management. To establish coherent and resilient networks of conservation areas requires a shift along this spectrum depending on local circumstances. So we're moving towards more engagement with the environment, more and bigger core sites, managing it as a network, having an ecosystem view, embracing dynamism and change, restoring natural processes, greater physical diversity, and increasing trophic and functional diversity also. The end goal should be to achieve a better balance of managed and natural areas than currently exists. Again, the final section of the Natural England document provides an overview of a number of tools and mapping data sets that could be useful to help planning and decision making. And there are descriptions of their capabilities and suggestions on how they might be used. To give you a scale of the effort here, on the 5th of November last year, Natural England, in association with 600 organisations, launched the Nature Recovery Network Delivery Partnership. It's the biggest initiative to restore nature ever to be launched in England, and it's part of the government's 25-year environment plan. There is a commitment to restore protected sites and to create new wildlife-rich habitats in towns and the countryside for people to enjoy. Other projects by individual conservation charities will also form part of this UK effort, such as large-scale river restoration projects, and indeed some of the NGO-led projects like Beelines by BugLife. And more recently, we have this example from Wales with collaboration between the National Heritage Memorial Fund and Welsh Government, and in March they launched a funding call for over almost £10 million with the objective of generating projects to improve the condition and connectivity of Wales's network of protected land and marine sites. The conceptual thinking around nature networks is not confined to the UK. The IUCN and the Convention on Biological Diversity have given us a global perspective on these areas of work, including these critical definitions of ecological networks, which bring together protected areas and what's called OECMS, connected by ecological corridors. So, ecological networks is a system of core habitats made of protected areas, OECMs, and other intact natural areas, connected by corridors, which are established by, which are generated by established sites and indeed restored sites. And their intention is to maintain biological diversity. So what are OECMs? They are a geographically defined area other than a protected area, which is governed and managed in a way that will achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes. So the key distinguishing criteria is that protected areas have a primary conservation objectives, whereas the other effective area-based conservation measures deliver the effective in situ conservation of biodiversity regardless of its objectives. Published in July 2020, this IUCN document is a very good starting reference for anyone keen to learn more about networks. They provide a common set of definitions and language with a focus on the unimpeded movement of species and the flow of natural processes. The scientific review confirmed that interconnected protected areas are much more effective than disconnected areas in human-dominated systems, especially in the face of climate change. They show that countries on every continent have advanced various forms of corridor legislation and policy to enhance connectivity. And they consolidated the science into guidance on best practice alongside case studies from a variety of terrestrial, marine, and mixed environments. The aims of the IUCN guidance on OECMS is set out above and includes looking at governance, ecologically representative areas, species, enhancing connectivity, engaging with stakeholders and supporting sustainable livelihoods, and ultimately trying to address climate change through the development of nature-based solutions. And work is ongoing on methodology for the identification of OECMs. So returning to the UK, let's consider the key evidence needs. Without doubt, ecological research will further define our understanding of the concept of nature networks and ecological resilience. And at the moment, there is a high dependency on available land use and land cover data and key abiotic data sets, with a strong appreciation that Earth observation will provide a common standard in future. An increasing number of separate network modeling programs and mapping tools are being used to produce a variety of spatial products at different scales. Other research needs relate to climate change, local ecosystem service delivery, and social science. You know, how do we best talk about nature and influence human decision making? And monitoring is crucial to demonstrate network development and success. And there needs to be a focus on defining indicators of resilience. Habitat network maps have been produced as a key resource by some of the countries, and we saw some examples of that last week. And we need to be mindful of the variation in approaches used, but the variety is not necessarily a cause for concern. It could be considered an advantage in a climate change context, as we do not necessarily know which approach will be most effective. So I'm coming to a conclusion here now. And in general, our review recognized that a fundamental challenge still relates to the public appreciation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Although the pandemic has certainly increased awareness of the important role of nature in human well-being. The place-based or local policy emphasis comes with the key test of delivering national and regional objectives at a local scale, which should be kept under review. Nature networks are also well placed to contribute to a green and just recovery post-COVID. Funding sources are in transition. They do need to be support long-term landscape scale work and include adaptive management and monitoring. Some landowners are understandably concerned with the risk associated with adaptive management. So there is a need for expert advice and training. And some of the presentations we heard last week made a very strong case around this, having the experts, having the trained operational staff to generate these projects on the ground is very important. And finally, nature network projects should be considered living laboratories or experiments that have the capability of attracting funding to deliver solutions to environmental challenges and support environmental education. And my final slide, we hope that the available policy opportunities are optimised across the UK and the individual countries in the UK. Borders and seas do not divide us, but give us the incentive to work together. We recognise that collaborative and interdisciplinary research will be needed to secure the evidence base and specialist advice. Funding project design is crucial. Again, projects need to be large scale and long term, but we are stronger if we work together for nature conservation. By acting locally, we can contribute globally. Thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. Gorf míle mágat.
Excellent, Catherine. That was a fantastic start for the day, I have to say. I think it was especially brilliant to get this sort of bigger picture context to, you know, what within which we are trying to obviously do our own thinking for Northern Ireland. So that was extremely useful. And I think that it's an excellent start, especially for the other two talks that we have for later today as well, you know, which will then be looking at more localized context and more specific delivery mechanisms. So I think that was extremely useful. So thank you very, very much for that, Catherine. In terms of actually of what you've just said, Catherine, and also in terms of the responses that we were getting from everybody in the audience on Slido when it comes to, you know, highlighting the importance on monitoring data, looking at things long term, you know, the legislative support. I wonder whether Laura and Monica, if we could launch the first poll. The first poll is actually asking, do we think that Northern Ireland should have legally binding nature recovery targets? Very strong support for targets then. And understandably, there's uncertainty around that too. Excellent, that is very interesting. I think we will leave it there. Could you end the poll? Fantastic. So 86% going for yes, and the rest really going for not sure. That's very interesting. Oops, that was me pressing the wrong button again. Right. So before we have a wee break, we'll have our second speaker. And this would be Max Hislop, who will be tuning in from Scotland, in fact. Max is a chartered forester and a social researcher by training, and has worked on social and community dimension of green infrastructure for the last 30 years. Max is the manager for the Glasgow and Clyde, Glasgow and Clyde Valley Green Network Partnership, which is a partnership of the 8th Glasgow City Region local authorities and 6 government agencies. He manages a team charged with facilitating delivery of a network of multifunctional green infrastructure across the Glasgow City region. And he's been in his role since 2007, and it's currently focused on this strategic planning for the green network through the development of spatial delivery plan and overcoming problems with green infrastructure delivery mechanisms. In the early 1990s, Max worked with the Thames, Chase and East London as their first community forester, and he then became a social and community forestry project leader with Forest Research, helping to establish a social forestry research program. Max, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nina. I see the poll is still visible at the moment.
Is it? Hold on then just a minute. You go through your screen sharing and we'll try to get that out of the screen. Still there?
Well, certainly I can see it.
Is that a problem for others on the panel as well? Because I can't see it.
I've just removed it from my screen. I don't know whether it's on other people's.
Yeah,
I can't see it, Nina.
You do see it?
No.
Great. And for anyone who might have the problem, there should be the option just for the X if it's still on your screen. But yeah, Max, you go ahead. Thanks for that, David.
Right, thank you very much, Nina, and thanks for this opportunity to talk to you today about the work that we've been involved in the Glasgow City region over the last 14 or 15 years. As Nina has said, I've been the manager for the partnership, for the Green Network Partnership over that period. And what I'm going to present to you today is a little bit of background, the development of our thinking about developing nature networks, or we call them habitat networks, within the Glasgow City region, how they've developed, some of the lessons we've learned from that, and how we're moving forward from that kind of analytical work into developing policies and then moving forward into delivery of those networks in the coming years. What you can see on this slide here is obviously a representation of Scotland, but it highlights the Glasgow and Clyde Valley area, or the Glasgow City region, made up of the 8 councils, with Glasgow City Council area in the middle. It's home to about 1.8 million people. So there's a large conurbation around Glasgow, but we also equally have a lot of rural area within the region as well. So as Nina has said, I'm just trying to progress my slides here. As Nina has said, the partnership's been around for since 2006 and was launched in 2007. And the partnership came about really to deliver against this image that was embedded at that time within the region's strategic development plan, or structure plan as it was then called. And this is a plan which is owned by the 8 local authorities and gives all that kind of strategic overview for more local planning. And this was the first time that the concept of a green network was represented within a planning document. And I think it's quite a useful image in the sense it portrays what the aim of the Green Network is all about. It shows that the Green Network weaves through the urban area of Glasgow and links out beyond the urban environment into green assets around the region, and those are represented by these arrows thrusting out into the rural area. And for that reason, within our team, it became known as the Dad's Army map, because of the thrusting arrows. Now this image wasn't based on any real scientific analysis. It was really developed through discussion between strategic and more local planners about what the opportunities were for delivering green networks within their local area, and then they kind of stitched it up together. And so it gave a starting point for us, I think, back in 2006 and 7, as to what we should be focusing in on, but wasn't really based on any kind of real scientific analysis. So soon after we started, we commissioned Forest Research to do what was then the first integrated habitat network modelling, I think, in the UK. And that brought together habitat network models for 4 different habitat types. And not only did that modelling identify where important habitat patches are, but also looked at how well connected those habitat patches are, how well functionally, if not physically connected, those habitat patches are. And if you just look at the transition in this image here, you can see that around the existing habitat patches, in this case of broadleaf woodland, we're seeing there's also this buffer, and this is a buffer based on a knowledge of the nature of the surrounding landscape and the ability of woodland species to move into that surrounding landscape to perhaps access other habitat patches. And what this information helps us to understand is whether these physically isolated patches of woodland are actually functionally connected to their neighbors. This is a really, I think, useful bit of information and helps to highlight those patches which remain isolated and perhaps where we need to intervene to make them connected, so they're not these isolated islands of habitat, which are vulnerable, of course, to all sorts of impacts, not least the pressures of climate change. So that was great. We were very pleased to get this piece of work completed in 2008. And we worked all the way through this process with local authority strategic planners to engage them in the process. And when it was completed, we handed over this data set effectively to our local planners and thought that that's the job done. You know, they'll be able to make use of this now and when they're thinking about planning decisions and how the landscape might change into the future. But the reality we found was that they didn't use it at all. And I think the message here is it doesn't matter how clever or fancy your habitat network model is and how robust it is in terms of its science and everything. If it's not going to be used, it's of no use, no practical use. So that was very depressing, actually, and we didn't give up with the habitat network modeling at that point, and we moved on a little later in 2010 to think about identifying opportunities for delivering the green network, opportunities mapping. And through that process, using GIS, we brought together 7 different data sets and we combined them in order to identify hotspots or these opportunities for delivery of the green network. And on the one hand, we were looking at land use opportunities like vacant and derelict land. There's a lot of that in the Glasgow region, where we know there was going to be new development and where there was existing green space which perhaps could work harder. And we brought them together with data on our priorities. And you can see the priorities laid out there. But within that, we embedded our integrated habitat network model. So that helped us to bring in the nature network dimension, I suppose, into this opportunities mapping work. And the result of that was that in the next iterations of the strategic development plan, we were able to identify what we called strategic delivery areas. These were effectively the hottest of the hotspots across our region. And that was useful. And I guess the lesson we learned from that was that planners will use data when it's embedded in a planning document, but they won't sort of engage with the direct data and the modeling directly. However, what you can see is that underlying those 16 hotspots on that image there, we still have that Dad's Army map lurking in the background. And that's because we still hadn't, if you like, taken the step or didn't have the confidence to portray the entirety of our network in a spatial way. We hadn't undertaken the analysis to allow us to do that, but we were moving forward nonetheless. So by 2019, we'd grasped the nettle, so to speak. We had by this stage undertaken sufficient analysis to allow us to represent the spatial green network, the green network spatially across our region based on analysis. And this is an infographic, a graphic display of that, what we call blueprint for the green network. And that blueprint is comprised of 2 essential networks, one for people, the access network, and one for nature and wildlife, the habitat network. Now, the access network was all about creating active travel opportunities within off-road and within green space. And of course, that is great in allowing people to have safe places to walk and cycle and to engage with nature. But our other aspect of the blueprint was the strategic habitat network. And you can see that this is made up of several colors which represent the range of different habitat types that we're interested in. Alongside the blueprint, we also gave some thought to the delivery mechanisms for the blueprint, and we categorized those into these four categories. And based on some other analysis, some costing analysis that we had taken a few years previously, we were able to estimate that the planning element of these delivery mechanisms could deliver more than a quarter of the capital costs of the green network within our region. We'd estimated that delivering the green network within our region would cost something in the order of £1.1 billion. And so, you know, harnessing the planning system to deliver that is very vital and delivers an awful lot of value. It isn't necessary, perhaps, to find all of that £1.1 billion in cash if we utilise the mechanisms we have at our disposal. Of course, when we think about the planning system, that's, I suppose, primarily comprised of plans, so things like the strategic development plan that I've already looked at, but crucially, the policies that sit within those plans are the mechanisms to bring about delivery of the aspirations of the plans. And then, of course, development management is crucial to ensure that those policies are adhered to by planning applicants. So we needed to give some thought to the policies within our region that would support the delivery of the blueprint. So the question was, at that time, how good are our green infrastructure policies? And I guess naively, before we did any kind of analysis, we assumed that our policies were pretty good. Green infrastructure was being talked about a lot around about that time, and we knew that people were writing green infrastructure policies, and we felt that probably we had a pretty good suite of green infrastructure policies across our region. But we thought we ought to test that assumption, and what we needed was some standards to test the policies against. And fortunately, just at the same time that we were developing our thoughts around this piece of work, Building with Nature, some of you might have heard of this, Building with Nature were developing green infrastructure standards, which they have now used as part of their process for accrediting good development. So we use those standards to develop a suite of policy assessment criteria. Some of those are about design of planning proposals. Some of them are about active travel and open space. Others are about water management. But within that, we also have policies to do with biodiversity and habitats. So we use these policy assessment criteria and tested them against local development plans in 19 local authorities across central Scotland within the Central Scotland Green Network area. And we use this colour code to classify the quality of the policies that we found within those local development plans and also supplementary guidance. And what we're looking for here are the green squares. Green means that they had very good comprehensive policies that covered the entirety of the criteria. And I think just a glance there, you can see that there isn't a full coverage of green. We've got quite a lot of white, which means there was no policy at all. Quite a lot of grey, which means there was only very partial coverage of the criteria. And orange means there was incomplete coverage of the criteria. Across the piece then, in those 19 local authorities, there was only 42% of the criteria that we felt were important for covering, fully covering green infrastructure issues. However, when we looked across those 19 local authorities and cherry-picked the best policies, what we found was that actually, if we cherry-picked them and lined them up, we could get almost a perfect suite of model policies that covered the entirety of what we were looking for. So it's perfectly possible to write good policies, it's just that it hasn't been actioned. So we took those best policies and we used them to create this suite of exemplar green infrastructure policies. There are essentially 6 elements to that suite. One is an overarching principle policy, then there are 4 functional policies, and then there's a stewardship policy about looking after and maintaining green infrastructure. Within those 4 functional policies, you'll see there's a habitat enhancements policy. And that says that development proposals should conserve and enhance on-site biodiversity and habitat networks within and adjacent to the site. But there is some additional information that lies behind that. In order to deliver that policy, we're asserting that it's important that a site is analysed and the context of the site is analysed in terms of its relationship to surrounding green infrastructure, that a planning application should be striving for biodiversity gain in order to leave things better than they were found, and that also the development should be adding to habitat connectivity wherever possible. So we embedded all of those suite of green infrastructure policies in this document called Planning for Green Infrastructure. A little later, I'll put a link to this document into the chat function. And we published that last year, and it's been taken up with enthusiasm. And it's influenced, in particular, Western Berkshire Council's local development plan. And as a result, the plan has received the Building with Nature Excellence Award. And then this was the first local development plan in the UK to receive such an award. So we're very pleased about that. But we've also presented the policies to the Scottish Government, to the team that are working on the 4th National Planning Framework, which is due to be published in the coming months. And I have high hopes that the policies that we've got within our document will feature within NPF4 and therefore level the playing field, if you like, for green infrastructure across Scotland. So coming back to the delivery mechanisms, I've been talking for a while now about planned development and planning policies and the rest of it. But obviously, 74% of the delivery of the blueprint falls into other categories. So we're having to think also about how we can marshal other resources to bring about the delivery of the blueprint as well as the planning system. So how do we go about developing delivery mechanisms and bring about the necessary resources for delivering, you know, our strategic habitat network and the 4 predominant habitat types that we represent within this model? Well, we're starting off by focusing in on the broadleaf woodland element of our strategic habitat network. And in June, this coming June, we're going to be launching the Clyde Climate Forest, which is our first delivery mechanism for the blueprint. And the Clyde Climate Forest is based around 3 elements, looking to expand urban tree canopy cover within the urban parts of the Glasgow conurbation, looking to expand new forests and woodlands on farmland and vacant and derelict land within our area, in order primarily to capture carbon emissions, but also to deliver a range of other benefits, not least things like natural flood management. And then in the center there, to deliver a regional woodland habitat network. And that's the direct link back to our blueprint. Together we call these 3 elements canopy, connectivity, and carbon, which is a pleasing alliteration. If we look behind the connectivity part of the Clyde Climate Forest, we're drawing directly on the habitat network modeling that I referred to earlier. And what you can see here across our region in the dark green is the broadleaf woodland habitat networks that we already have within our region. But our most recent analysis has gone a bit further than that and has identified the major opportunities for connecting up our existing woodland habitat network. And those are the green stars you can see on this image. There are 101 opportunities that we've identified across our region. And if we were successful in delivering all of those 101 connections, then we would expand the average woodland habitat network area within our region by more than 30%, which is a significant gain. But on top of that, the Clyde Climate Forest is also looking to achieve a migration route for species from the south of Scotland into the northern part of Scotland. Central Scotland is a topographical pinch point with the Firth of Clyde and the Firth of Forth to the west and east. And on top of that, we've got these upland areas of the Campsies and the Pentlands and so on. And of course, the conurbation of Glasgow and Grey itself is a barrier to species migration. So it's very much a case of looking to thread the needle through this through this pinch point of central Scotland. And this is what we're looking to try and achieve with the Clyde Climate Forest. And we've embarked and commissioned, upon some research work, commissioned forest research to do some additional analysis to our habitat network modelling to identify the least cost corridors for creating this contiguous broadleaf woodland habitat network from the south of our region through to the north and linking into the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. And that will add additional opportunities, target areas for us for woodland creation, and we will endeavour to do that. So over the next 10 years, we will be delivering against the aims of the Clyde Climate Forest on each of these elements. When it comes to the connectivity element, aside from creating that migratory corridor, we aim to increase the average woodland habitat network area by 20%. And when it comes to the other two categories, we're looking to achieve a 20% urban canopy cover and increase woodland cover in our region from 17% to 20% over a 10-year period. It's pretty ambitious, but we believe that's the level of ambition that we need to respond to the climate and ecological crisis. So that's just one of our delivery projects against the blueprint, the Clyde Climate Forest. But we're starting developing a suite of projects which all nest together. So when we think about our bog and peatland habitats, we're going to be developing a Clyde Peatland Action Project. When it comes to our grassland habitats, we'll be developing a beelines project, and it's nice that was mentioned a little earlier on this morning. And when it comes to our wetland habitats, we're going to be developing a Clyde Water Catchment Project. And of course, finally, for the access network, we'll be looking to develop a greenways project as well. So that is where we are with the development of our green network delivery, and how nature networks or habitat networks are a key part of our thinking and helping drive forward our delivery projects and guiding our delivery projects. Thank you very much for listening.
Excellent, Max. Thanks so much. I think it was really interesting to see kind of where you started from and what those steps that you had taken along the way to get to where you are now, especially in terms of producing that blueprint, and what kind of pieces of the puzzle I guess had to be in place in order for you to be able to produce that, and now be able to actually then highlight actual projects and initiatives, which is actually really exciting. So I guess it must have been quite interesting to have been involved all the way through from 2006 or 2007, and now seeing that starting to be realized. So it must be quite an exciting point in time for you as well, and just obviously how you've taken this sort of integrated approach in terms of looking at ecosystem services on the whole, and not just focusing on purely on biodiversity benefits, but how that all is sort of interlinked. So I think that was really, really interesting. So thank you very, very much for that.
You're welcome.
So obviously that's been quite a lot of information for the first hour and 15 minutes. And thank you for all of our first two speakers for sticking to the time so well, because in fact I ran a little bit over, which made me think that we might need to reduce the length of our break a little bit, but I think we are back on time, which is fantastic. So thank you for that, Max. So what we'll do now, we'll have a quick 15-minute break, so we can all absorb a little bit what we've been hearing about, but also just to refresh ourselves. So if we can take a 15-minute break and be back at 11 o'clock sharp, which I believe should be exactly on schedule. So if you could, Laura and Monica, if you could just put that time onto the chat, but we'll take a 15-minute break, and we'll be back all at 11. See you in a minute. Welcome back, everybody. I hope we all feel a little bit more refreshed after a wee break. Our last speaker for today on our panel is David Murray. David is the Senior Planner at the Fingal County Council's Planning and Strategic Infrastructure Department. For those of you who in fact attended the first session last week, you might remember that we heard from Fingal County Council's Biodiversity Officer Hans Visser, who has been working with David on delivering this concept of ecological networks at a local county level. And obviously, David really represents this planning side of things, and he will be telling us how he has been working towards delivering the concept through planning in particular. So it will be very nice to see this even more narrowed down sort of local perspective on delivery, and especially the role of planning and the policy that drives that at a local scale. So David, please do fire away.
Thank you, Nina. And firstly, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank yourself for the opportunity to present at the Northern Ireland Nature Recovery Networks webinar series, and to commend my co-presenters on the excellence of their own presentations. I just hope mine lives up to the high standard that's been set so far. So, are you able to see that? No?
Yep, perfect.
Okay. I'm afraid it's not showing on my own screen.
Oh dear, we do see the first slide here, the introductory slide. Just let me know if you're having trouble, and obviously we can share it from our end. I do have it at hand here, so just let me know if you want to do it that way, and we'll go from there. We'll give it a couple of minutes and we can see if we can make it work. You're muted, David. Are you able to unmute yourself, David?
Sorry. Thanks, Nina. I can't see the slides at the moment at all, so I don't know where I am on the starting slide.
Do you want me to share it from my side? Would that be easier? It has worked so well so far with my presentations, because obviously you send it through, so I have it here. So you can just tell me when to swap slides and so on, if that was easier.
If you would, that would be great.
Well, we'll give that a go. Just a moment. Right, let's see.
Super. Okay, I can see those now. Thank you very much, Nina. And
perfect. And if you just tell me when you want me to swap slides, and I shall try to attempt my very best.
Brilliant. Okay, so I've looking at my timer. I have about 26 minutes to get through this then, so I'll get cracking. So just Nina gave my introduction to myself. I'm a senior planner in Fingal County Council. It's a particularly busy local authority, and I'll set out the context in the next few slides. I deal with 3 development management teams, those who are assessing and delivering decisions on planning applications. And the part of Fingal that I deal with is both in the urban and the rural part of the county. Previous to this role, I was involved in heading up a team which was involved in plan or policy making. Next slide, please, Nina. So this presentation, it is set within the context of achieving an ecological network in Fingal. and is within the statutory policy context of the Republic of Ireland. Fingal County Council was the first to set out and adopt a green infrastructure network in its development plan in 2011, and it's a multi-layered network which is underpinned by empirical data and policy. In this presentation, I aim to set out the support structure for an ecological network, which is provided by policy, to provide examples of the use of a policy framework to provide an ecological network. And in this, I'll set out a county-wide example and two local or area-specific examples. I'll touch on the idea of hard policy and soft policy and how a framework can overcome those issues. And finally, then to set out how the policy framework relating to an environmental network can impact on planning decisions. Next slide, please, Nina. Just to give a quick overview of the Irish planning system, you see there's the National Planning Framework at the top of the hierarchy. It's a statutory document, and that is, I suppose, that sets out overarching policy, which is taken up by the regional spatial economic strategy, and that's then fed down into the local development plans. And then you can see what feeds into all of that is EU national legislation and policy, which to a degree is hard policy, as I referenced before. And then within the local authority, you see all of the various issues that are brought to bear there. And that all sets up the policy framework for assessing planning applications. And again, I suppose cross-cutting on all of this is the Office of the Planning Regulator, which was established in 2019 in order to ensure consistency between national, regional and local plans. Next slide, please. So just to give a brief overview of Fingal County, you can see us there, the top blue part in the Dublin region. We're quite a small county, and we were formed by the breakup of Dublin County Council into 3 local authorities in 1994. So the regional authority that we sit within is the Eastern and Midland region, and you can see us there within the context of the island of Ireland. Population of the county in the last census was 300,000, and by 2031 we're mandated to have a population of 350,000, and again that's set out in the National Planning Framework and the RCS. So it's a control in order to ensure balanced regional and local development, and we deliver approximately 2,000 to 2,500 dwellings per annum as part of the delivery of housing on sustainable locations, based around the key idea of provision of public transport. On to the next slide, please. So you can see here just the settlement strategy for the county, and this really sets the context of the development pressure that might be expected, especially on the green infrastructure network. You can see in the orange area, Dublin City and its suburbs, which would include Blanchardstown in the western part of the county. You've then got Swords, which is the key county town, and then the green towns along the coast of Balbriggan, Skerries, Rush, Donabate, Lusk and Malahide. And these are built along existing heavy rail routes. So there's key public transport in these areas, and the National Development Plan has set out that these will be upgraded to electrified rail in the near future. So again, there's key public transport provision and the development of sustainable communities based around this. But as you can see from the image to the image on the right, which sets out the green infrastructure in Fingal, this is also the area that has the highest degree of overlap with environmentally sensitive sites. And you can see there the dark green areas are the Natura 2000 network of SACs and SPAs. You also have purple Annex 1 habitats. You have the yellow buffer zone areas associated with the associated with the Natura 2000 sites, as well as the green infrastructure network of rivers and nature development areas in addition to that. So having a strongly supported ecological network is a key and integral part of the sustainable development agenda, which we will be whereby we are facilitating development proximate to public transport systems, but also having to have regard to the green infrastructure network, and having this network set up and integrated into the development plan is a key part of that. Next slide, please, Nina. Just in terms of, I suppose, referring back to, I suppose, one of the items that Max raised, which was the integration of national and regional strategy. The National Planning Framework sets out the growth agenda for the state, and it has these 10 key national strategic outcomes, which you can see here. and I suppose NSO 8, transition to a low carbon and climate resilient society, and 9 set out, I suppose, the high level agenda for development in the state. And these are then supported by approximately 100 or so national policy objectives. And this is then supported again by a costed national development plan, which sets out the impact of, I suppose, the cost of development in accordance with the balanced regional strategies associated with the MPF. So it's considered, I suppose, it's the highest land use planning document in the state. And on the next slide, you'll see the regional spatial economic strategy, which we operate within and which has direct reference to the MPF. You can see again the regional strategy, the regional strategic objectives which are there, and there's a significant section on climate action, again with reference to biodiversity and natural heritage and enhanced green infrastructure, and these again are supported by regional policy objectives. On the next slide, you see where I suppose there's a legal statutory requirement for compliance and alignment of all of these, and the slide after this will show where that's impacted upon. But you can see here that there's, as a reference to the Office of the Planning Regulator previously, the Planning Regulator is there in order to ensure that the development plans are compliant with the National Planning Framework and the Regional Spatial and Economic Strategy. And the Regional Assembly, who undertake the RSES, also have a statutory role in ensuring that the development plan is compliant with the national planning, with the RSES. So there's a key level of oversight whereby ministerial recommendation, which no planning authority wants to have, could be issued directing us to be compliant with the National Planning Framework or the RSES where it's not in place. So there is, I suppose, there's a carrot and stick approach there in ensuring that plans are compliant with each other, both at all levels of the hierarchy. And on the next slide, you can see an example that I've taken in terms of where that's applied in the Fingal development plan, in terms of, I suppose, parts of the green infrastructure network. So you can see National Policy Objective 58 from the National Planning Framework, which sets out integrated planning for green infrastructure and ecosystems services will be incorporated into the preparation of statutory land use plans. So it's an MPO, we're statutorily obliged to comply with this. And then the regional policy objectives in the green boxes set out, I suppose, the regional level policy for that, which again sets out that we identify, protect and enhance and manage green infrastructure, and that there should be regional mapping of that. And interesting, I suppose, it was interesting looking at Max's presentation in terms of how that's being done in his area. It's not something that has been prioritized so far in the Republic of Ireland, but it's there as an objective. And you can see again, there's a further objective relating specifically to riparian setbacks and supporting the development of guidance for those to achieve appropriate setback distances to support the attainment of ecological status. And it sets out all of the elements that are there that would I suppose, be supported and improved by the riparian setbacks. And then you can see the bottom objective, which relates to the Fingal development plan, and how that has a strong objective specifically setting out required distances for riparian strips for all water courses, and then increasing the size of that for named water courses as part of our own green infrastructural network, where there's a recognised biodiversity improvement that will be that would come from the increased size of the riparian strip. So again, it's just demonstrating at a policy level how there's an integrated approach whereby in discussing development proposals that planners can clearly tie this back to from local to regional to national policy. And on the next slide, I'm going to reference how this can be further supported by the idea of cross-cutting themes. So you can see on the left there all of the chapters within the Fingal development plan. And within the plan, there's a replication of policy. There's a replication specifically of green infrastructural policy or green network policy through the plan. And I consider this to be quite important in terms of achieving the aims of the Green Infrastructure Network. So you can see within the Planning and Development Act what a development plan has to contain. It must contain objectives on the conservation and protection of the environment, on the Habitats Directive, and the management of features of ecological coherence for the Nature 2000 network. compliance with environmental standards, the river basin management plan, surface water bodies, groundwater bodies, preservation of landscape character, and the preservation, improvement, and extension of amenities and recreational amenities. So there's a key number of hooks that green infrastructural objectives or policies can be put onto as part of requirements of the planning acts to be incorporated within the development plan. And you can see on the next slide how that's been done specifically. So again, the idea of cross-cutting themes in chapter 1, where we talk about a number of these, but the ones I've referenced for this presentation are sustainable development and climate change adaptation. And you can see how that's replicated through a number of different chapters in the development plan. So within chapter 7, movement and infrastructure, again, there's the water quality objective with regards to riparian corridors. That's further replicated again within chapter 8, green infrastructure, which is to resist development that would fragment or prejudice the county's strategic green infrastructure network. And then again, we require all new development to contribute to the protection and enhancement of existing green infrastructure and the delivery of new green infrastructure. Again, similarly within the natural heritage chapter, protect the ecological functions and integrity of the corridors indicated on the development plan, green infrastructure maps. And then in the development management standards, which for busy planners is probably one of the main chapters that they're going to refer to. There's 2 specific objectives that break out objective WQ05 into the specific instances that might apply on a site. And in terms of, I suppose, in terms of using these objectives to convey to an applicant the need to have regards to comply with these objectives, having these within these different chapters is extremely useful, especially having it within what might be a hard engineering chapter, such as movement and infrastructure, so that it's not something that, let's say, sits in its own chapter to do with natural heritage or green infrastructure, and as Max mentioned, there may be ignored, maybe not be given sufficient weighting. By having it as part of a cross-cutting theme and overlapping throughout a number of chapters, it gives weight to the objectives to retain and maintain. And it's something that's far more easily conveyed to developers of the importance of achieving these objectives and complying with these objectives, because they're put into so many different parts of the development plan. So on the next slide, you can see, for example, with the reference to the green infrastructure mapping, which was referred to as part of the previous objective, it sets out so somebody can clearly see what the green infrastructure elements that might affect their area might be. And you can see, for example, the example of rivers and ecological rivers along corridors, where it's clearly identified what those rivers and streams are, which would have a 10 to 15 meter buffer, and those which would have the larger buffer as well. So it's clearly set out, it's clearly provided for in policy that the protection of these and the improvement of these is required. And because it's mapped and because it's supported by these objectives and policies, it's achieved, it's done. It has to be undertaken as part of any planning proposal. And I suppose in the next 2 sections, I'm going to give demonstrations of the local examples that we have in Fingal County Council. So on the next slide, please, Nina, I'm referring to the Portmarnock local area plan. So on the left, you can see the relatively innocuous zoning map. It indicates residential zoned land. It's the kind of the beige color in the northern part of the map. It's got open space to the south, and it's got a significant amount of high amenity zoned land in the area. But on the right, you can see, I suppose, the more significant ecological aspects and sensitivities of the site, of the land that are in the vicinity, including the Natura 2000 network in Baldoyle Estuary and the SPA and SAC in those lands, as well as the purple Annex 1 habitat. You can see the yellow striped buffer zones that are associated with the Natura 2000 sites, as well as the ex-hatched nature development areas. So there's a significant degree of environmental sensitivity in this area, but there's also zoned land which is proximate to a public transport railway station. So there's I suppose it's achieving the balance between the need for providing for homes in this location with the environmental sensitivity of the site. And the green infrastructure map, which was in place for 2011, clearly set out what was the green infrastructure agenda for this area, and that fed in significantly to the development of the statutory local area plan for the lands, which is on the next slide. So you can see there that the plan comprised of the written statement, the strategic flood risk assessment, the strategic environmental assessment, and the Natura impact report. And all of three of these supporting documents, the SCA, the AA assessment, and the strategic flood risk assessment, were all key documents for feeding into and changing and ensuring that key aspects of green infrastructure were incorporated into the plan, the phasing of the plan, and the layout of the plan. And on the next slide, I'll give you just quickly run through how that was achieved. So the environmental report, the SCA, and for example, raised awareness of the level of environmental information in the LAP area, which is clearly identified in the green infrastructure mapping. The sensitive nature of the EU designated sites, being the SACs and SPAs, and how that impacted on the land in terms of the use of the land by the qualifying interests associated with those SACs with the SPAs. And it facilitated the introduction of a very comprehensive concept of green infrastructure into the LAP, which was the first time we had done it in Fingal. And it emphasised the need to provide suitable habitats for native and visiting species to the area. And this is a very important gain from the SCA and the LAP perspective. And as well as that, it emphasised the necessity of maintaining and improving the quality of surface water into Baldoyle Bay, and also provided a transparent assessment of each policy so that it could be fine-tuned. So in the next slide, you'll see, I suppose, just in graphical form, how that impacted on the overall layout. And one of the key things here is that, I suppose, the green infrastructure chapter, which was a part of the LAP and had a very significant number of objectives, approximately 50 of them, really provided the key direction for development of the land, far more so than the LAP provided in terms of the shape or form or layout of housing. It really left that more up to planning application stage, but what it did set out was the requirements of the developer in terms of how the development of the land had to be phased with the provision and improvement of particular habitat in order to complement what was the environmental sensitivity of the land. And you can see here, for example, that it identified species habitat protection improvements, ecological buffer zones, which essentially would be all of the green land there outside of the white area where the residential development is to take place. It identified key landscape elements where there was views, where there was hedgerows and townland boundaries. It identified the archaeological zones in the area and provided for linkage of those both visually and physically. And then it provided for amenity integration also in terms of walking routes, cycling routes. And I think this was a key part of this LAP, which was replicated in others in terms of recognizing the impact that development is going to have on sensitive sites in terms of bringing additional people into a particular area who are going to want to walk, they're going to want to cycle, they're going to want to walk dogs, and providing for designated and identified areas in order to facilitate that in a way that doesn't compromise the qualifying interests of the Natura 2000 sites. And so it identified quiet zones, as you can see here, sacrificial arable crops, again, to provide for additional habitat for the use of this green space, this green area by by waders and by overwintering birds, and also generally improving the habitat and biodiversity of the area. On the next slide, you can see, for example, how that was laid out. And really, I don't intend to repeat it. It's set out, for example, where those particular areas were, and what it also set out was a phasing for the delivery of those. It set out how they were to be managed. It set out that management was to be undertaken prior to applying for planning permission, so that by the time planning applications were being made, that the habitat improvements had taken place or were about to take place, so that the developer was well aware that making planning applications prior to this taking place would be very likely to result in a refusal either from ourselves or from the appeals board, based on the impact of the development upon the qualifying interests associated with the Natura 2000 sites. So with this, with the water quality objectives, with the significant SUDS train that there was in this LAP, these all needed to be done in order to avoid impact on environmentally sensitive sites and to improve, I suppose, the ex situ elements of that, or to improve the buffer zones of that, so that there was environmental gains to be made from the development of the land. On the third and final example, I'm going to refer to the Donna Bate Local Area Plan on the next slide. And what the Donna Bate Local Area Plan really, I suppose, set out is it was taking the lessons that were learned, and that I suppose it took the Portmarnock LAP and used that, replicated that for a second instance. You can see it's a significant land bank, again located on a public transport route, which is the Dublin to Belfast line, railway line. There's a requirement for 4,000 homes within the LAP land and social infrastructure associated with that. But you can see from the slide, the right-hand side of the slide, again, a very, very sensitive peninsula. With Natura 2000 designations to the north and south in terms of the estuaries that were there or are there. There's flooding, there's ex situ feeding sites, there's erosion, and a patchwork quilt of sensitive habitats. Again, as you can see from the Annex 1 habitats that are there, the nature development areas and the buffer zones. And on the next slide, I'll just quickly set out what the LAP attempted to achieve. And again, it used the integration of the appropriate assessment and SEA process in order to provide for the protection of qualifying interests and for habitat protection and augmentation. But a key issue here, far more so than perhaps in the first example, was the protection of buffer areas or the management of sensitive areas, in order to avoid the impact of a significant additional influx of people onto the sensitive habitats of the area. And again, the fact that within the Fingal development plan there was a mapped green infrastructure network, these areas were identified, they were supported by empirical data. We could, and this was, I suppose, as Hans Visser would have mentioned last Wednesday, this is something that Fingal County Council have been investing in by way of the biodiversity officer role and Hans' management of staff and management of resources to ensure that areas are being surveyed and that we have the data to support over a consistent period of time the designation and identification of sites, so that we as planners can be confident that our decisions are based on that empirical data source and that the policy is grounded in that level of research. So what this, I suppose, was doing and what this was demonstrating was this plan put a strong emphasis on the phasing and delivery of the green infrastructural improvements or requirements to maintain it within the, I suppose, the phasing of development. So the phasing of development would have been set out based on the idea of a level of housing provision. And on the next slide, you can see how that was done, whereby there's specific green infrastructure objectives set out within the LAP. There's the identification of the walking routes that were required to be developed in order to avoid the impact of the occupation of housing, the influx of people on sensitive sites, on dune habitats, on those which were subject to erosion and wouldn't be easily recovered, so that the intensity of use could be directed into particular areas that were away from the green infrastructure network that's there and the ecological networks that have been identified. And crucially, that it was set out as part of the phasing when these were to be delivered. And I suppose this has been useful, one, because again, it's clearly identified to developers where they must undertake particular works and transfer particular lands to us as part of their development proposals. So, for example, you can see there's a nature development area in the green image in the center of this slide is the development of a nature park, which is a key part of one of the buffer proposals associated with the SPA for Rogerstown Estuary. And as part of any granted planning application, the developer must transfer that land to us after they've undertaken the works to the Nature Development Park. So as Max mentioned, it's an indication. That's one of the ways whereby we improve our green network, but the developer pays for it, and the developer delivers the land to ourselves, and that's provided for by the phasing of the LAP statutory document. Without that, we wouldn't have any chance, particularly, of getting that land transferred over to ourselves. We may have to CPO it. So that's one of the key routes in terms of delivering on the improvements to the green infrastructure, or to providing for the green networks that will be set out in your development plan. So that's
5 minutes, please, David.
That's actually the final slide, Nina. I just would like to recap. I suppose the key points that I take out of this is that it's a policy that's set out within the hierarchy for ourselves and the Republic within the National Planning Framework, the RSES, and the Development Plan, means that we have a very strong policy framework to be able to, one, develop local area plans out of that, two, to map the requirements of our green infrastructure network, and three, to require it to be undertaken by way of planning applications. So the fact that there's that consistency there, that those decisions are supported at the planning appeals level, again, because there has to be consistency with the three parts of the hierarchy of planning policy. And that there's, I suppose, that they're consistently, I suppose that there's a linear derivation from each. You could see that there was a clear route from the objective that I showed in the National Planning Framework to the RSES to that which is within the Development Plan. So again, it's the writing of policy to reflect what's contained in the upper level documents, so that again it can be clearly seen where we're deriving the requirements to protect the green infrastructure network from. And as I mentioned as well, the idea of cross-cutting themes within the development plan or the statutory plan that you're going to use. My own personal opinion is that if these policies were simply contained in a green infrastructure network chapter, they may be overlooked by busy planners. They may not be quite so obvious, whereas when they're in the hard policy areas of the plan and they're overlapping within that, then everybody has recognition and oversight of them, and each particular section of a local authority has buy-in to them as well. And then at the local plan level, the provision of data-driven evidence, the use of SCA to incorporate the aspects which you want to see as part of the green infrastructure network into those statutory local plans, and then consideration of phasing carefully to actually deliver the improvements to the green infrastructure network. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, David. Can I just clarify something very quickly in terms of the terminology of green infrastructure network? Am I correct in thinking, I think this was a conversation I had with Hans previously, was that, and especially in the context of him referring to ecological networks last week, that there's been this shift within the team at Fingal to move away from calling it ecological networks and starting to call that green infrastructure networks instead. But in terms of the meaning behind that, it's quite similar.
Well, I suppose I wasn't aware of Hans' presentation last week. I suppose I was using perhaps the terminology interchangeably, to be honest with you, Nina, as part of this presentation. What planners would be doing in looking at this is what's contained within the policy. So what's the terminology that's used in the policy, and that offers the direction for the planner in assessing or undertaking pre-planning, and then how that's replicated in terms of the mapping of it is going to be a key part of that too. So, in a plan-led approach, it's going to be what's contained within the objectives and the policies that they're going to implement. To a degree, they may not end up interrogating that further in order to understand the meaning that might be gained behind it. It's simply going to be a case of looking at the policy, the objectives, and implementing that. All
right, thank you. Well, we did make that work in the end. Fantastic. And I think that was really interesting, actually, David, to get that more practical perspective on a sort of a type of policy and how that is being delivered on the ground. And I guess just the importance of you highlighting, the key word of it having to be cross-cutting in terms of making sure that, this sort of ideology is not just written within its own chapter, but that it needs to be cross-cutting, throughout the documentation. I think that was really valuable. And it was really great to get those local examples of Pormarnock and Donabate, I think they were called, and it just see in practice, what that means, how we come from the policy and the text, but what that actually means on the ground and how that has been delivered on the ground. So I think that was extremely valuable. So that was fantastic. Could we now get all the panelists to turn your cameras on, and we'll move on to the Q&A. I think we have a couple of questions that have come through already, which is fantastic, but I'll just do a very quick run through how we are going to do this. If I manage to share my screen again, there we go. So this one. So basically, like I touched upon earlier on, please use the Q&A functionality if you would like me to pose your question to any of our panelists. And please do mark down who you want to ask that from, whether there is one of our panelists or more of them, even all at one go. And if you would like your question to be anonymous, there should be a box that you can tick within the Q&A functionality, which you should be finding either at the bottom or at the top of your screen on Zoom. And of course, in case we have an influx of questions, it could be that we can't go through all of them. So there is a functionality within the Q&A box to use the thumbs up function, which basically will allow us to see which questions that you are finding especially important, so we can then use that to prioritize. So please use that in case there's a question that is already there that you were also hoping to ask. I shall stop, hopefully. That was too early. How do I stop my sharing? There we go. And I will just open up the Q&A for myself as well. But yeah, please do start using that, and we can start going through these questions. And I know there's quite a few that have come through already. I guess the first one really is from Annika Clements, and it's a two-part question for Catherine, and why not also the other panelists as well. And the first part of the question is, where would you initially prioritize government funding when it comes to nature recovery networks? Would you ensure that first there's evidence and data collected, or would you start from looking at agri-environment schemes or local authorities and so on? Would you have any idea, Catherine, in terms of whether there is a sort of an approach in terms of prioritizing within where to start when you're setting up something like this? And obviously that then potentially might relate to our journey in Northern Ireland. And also, do you think, and I think you touched upon this already, it's quite a lengthy question, do you think that there is a role for private investors and companies in terms of fast tracking this approach? I know it's a lot to ask. I wonder whether you have any views on that, Catherine?
Okay, so let's take the first part of the question, which is around evidence. And as a champion of evidence-based decision-making for policy development and for operations for nature conservation, I'm going to give you a predictable answer around this and say, yes, evidence is very important. So I've sketched out a bit of a mind map here on a piece of paper as to how you'd approach that evidence base and what should be in it. I think very fundamental and starting components would be around protected areas, knowing the diversity and location of your protected areas, and land use data and the condition of that land as well. And I'm quite struck by the lack of references we've had in the conference to marine. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that and how it fits into the general picture here, because there should be a continuum from land to sea when you're thinking about mapping, or having the land use maps. And I believe that JNCC is actually helping Northern Ireland produce habitat maps. So habitat maps, fundamental component, producing maps, then using models to help with where you want to go, what are your objectives of the network. I'd also advise that having determining your baseline, so know where you are now and what you have a good idea. Try and come up with a narrative around what will success look like for you, and what indicators should be linked to those objectives to measure success. I think if you're thinking about the evidence base, I would really advise you to think about collaborative working from the very start. So get a group of potential evidence providers into a room, research organizations of any kind, engage with your NGOs, your RSPB Science, for example, any other research organizations, and that will, really hopefully help influence the funding sources if you have a coalition with a very clear focus on what research is needed. I think I was very struck last week with the strong cases made by several of the speakers around having trained practitioners, and that's also worthwhile thinking about. We're really on the cutting edge of a new approach to environmental management, and we need to make sure we have the people who can think in a new way and
100%.
deliver this kind of work on the ground. So there is an opportunity and a challenge, I think, specifically for the education and academic community to produce those kind of people, but equally a great opportunity for NGOs or conservation organizations to make use of these bright new minds in terms of secondments or placements. So, think about that flow of knowledge you need to have. And then I'd also encourage you from the start to think about how you'd go about sharing that evidence base, making it available for the people on the ground. And that's going to be a particular, potentially IT challenge. Yeah. And Max is going to come in on that one, I think.
Thank you, Catherine. I didn't mean to interrupt, but yeah, I was smiling at that because, of course, within my presentation, I think I described that we started off with the evidence. And in fact, we did work. We brought together a partnership of all sorts of organizations to help us build that integrated habitat network, as we called it way back. And then, of course, we did look to try and make it available to people. But of course, as I mentioned in my presentation, it wasn't used. And so there's a real learning point there. I think it was an excellent piece of work. In fact, we've still used that original piece of work over the preceding years. But I think that the point about having people there who understand the data, understand the science behind the data, and can interpret it for, if you like, other professions, people who are lay perhaps to the kind of subject that we're actually talking about, is really important. And that just sort of packaging it up and handing it over to people doesn't necessarily, and at least in our experience, lead to success. That actually you need people there to interpret it and tell the narrative, explain the story behind it and integrate it into other decision making. And of course, planners, as we heard from David in his presentation, are having to deal with a myriad of issues, and nature and ecological networks are just one of the many things they're having to weigh up. So they're not going to spend a huge amount of time trying to get their head around it. They need people to interpret it for them. So in my opinion, if there's a need for investment anywhere, it's in those people who act as, if you like, the knowledge transfer experience. Yes, we need to invest in the evidence and all the very good research and produce the maps and all the rest of it. But that isn't the end of the job. That is only the start of the job. And
I agree completely, but hopefully the evidence will give us a path to go along. And the final point I'd like to make around evidence is consideration of scale. So you can imagine you can produce national scale maps identifying governmental priorities. But then when you look to delivery on the ground, you'll have local projects which may have their own more regional objectives. So for example, you could imagine a community identifying, say, flood risk management as one of their key priorities. And that might require a specific evidence base to address the objectives of local projects.
Thank you very much for that, Catherine. I think actually it was very useful how you mentioned that importance of understanding scale and how we might have to work at this at different scales, because there was a question which was directed for Max in particular from Esme Cleland. And she mentioned that strategic development plans will not be mandatory in the future and many areas don't have one currently. What geographic level do you think is needed to deliver a nature or habitat network framework successfully? Can it be done at a planning authority area level, or does it need to be regional, or should it be national? Any views on that?
yeah, well, I do have views on that. Obviously, I've been working at a regional level, and I think it's a little bit like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You know, I think national level might be a little bit too big. I think local authority level might be a little bit too small. I think regional level might be just right. But I mean, you might expect me to say that, but I do think that is a useful scale to work at. In fact, our 8 local authorities pretty much make up the catchment of the Clyde, the River Clyde. And I think there's something very, I don't know, there seems to be a natural kind of catchment level approach to this kind of thinking, I think. Yeah, of course, strategic development plans in Scotland are being removed because of the new Planning Act we've had in Scotland recently. The strategic development plan, it really was the starting point for the development of the whole of the Glasgow Clyde Valley Green Network Partnership. So I mourn their demise, and it's hard to know what the impact will be in the future of removing that level of strategic planning. However, there will be regional spatial strategies. That isn't a requirement in the new Planning Act. And then in some ways, that might be a major opportunity to embed ecological networks or however we want to describe them into the new planning system in Scotland through regional spatial strategies. And there's also a push to have land use planning partnerships. In a way, within the Glasgow and Clyde Valley area, there's a tradition of having, if you like, land use planning partnerships. So the 8 local authorities have a tradition of working together. That's not necessarily replicated across Scotland. But I think we're in a good position to transition from having this strategic development plan into regional spatial strategies and land use planning partnerships. So I think that will be the home for this kind of thinking in the future.
Yeah, it's really interesting for you to say that, because it's something that obviously we touched upon already today, but last week as well, you know, 1, the importance of working together and partnerships, but 2, also whether in terms of setting up partnership, something along the lines of a regional or a local land use or even nature network partnership, whether that would be relevant, because it's fine enough for us to have this sort of a national vision, but how do we actually contribute towards that at a more local level, which is practical, but at the same time big enough to actually start producing useful outcomes, but also bringing, you know, these different initiatives or different organizations under a little bit of an umbrella, so that all that expertise that, again, we've touched upon could be utilized, you know, in a strategic way. So I think that was really interesting. There was another question for you, Max, from Ben Ross, and I think, David, you might be able to, it would be nice to hear your perspective on this as well. Ben said, Max, fascinating presentation and great work. Lots there for people to consider. On reflection, what do you consider to be the biggest learning points really on that journey? And maybe we've touched upon this a little bit as well already, in terms of pitfalls to avoid, advice to others, and so on.
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, I've mentioned, I think, one of the biggest pitfalls, and our naivety, I suppose, in the early days of just creating a model and handing it over and expecting it to be used. So that's probably the biggest learning point I wanted to make in my presentation. But perhaps a more subtle learning point, which I didn't emphasize, was the graphics that we've used and how important they are in getting buy-in. So in the early days, we tended to show outputs, data outputs, quite complicated maps and GIS outputs. And, you know, if you're a GIS user or a planner, you kind of maybe you're quite excited by that, but other people are not, or perhaps don't even want to start to get their head around them. And actually trying to make the information or get the essence of the information interpreted and presented to people, I think is in an attractive way, is really an important thing. So long as those graphics are based on the science and are not, you know, they've got to be based on something, not just, you know, founded on nothing. And that's what I think we did with our blueprint imagery. So that whole kind of more infographic style is all based on GIS outputs and analytical undertakings. But, you know, it's quite an attractive looking thing, and it's been used by politicians and significant people within our region because they like it. They just like the look of it, and they like the idea that behind it. They have engaged with it, and I don't think can underestimate the importance of packaging up, you know, scientifically based ecological data within something which is kind of appealing. And so the further progression of that, I suppose, is the delivery project like the Clyde Climate Forest, where we have packaged up the ecological network within this broader suite of things to do with urban tree planting and carbon and all the rest of it, which is obviously very much of the moment. But we're getting the ecological network embedded in that as well, and it's kind of sweetened with the other aspects of the project. So I think that whole idea of presentation and packaging is really important if we want to engage with people outside of our kind of ecological community.
Yeah, I think that's a very, very valid point, and I think that goes somewhat, at least, back to what David was mentioning about as well. You know, the right wording being in the right places for people to pick it up and actually utilize that. I wonder, David, as well, in terms of, you know, you have already having worked at this at least for 10 years. So I wonder whether you have any obvious sort of learnings that you could pick up on at all. And in fact, I might read this out already from Michelle Hill for you, David. She was very interested in hearing how successful the LAPs have been in actually securing development, retention, or enhancement of the green infrastructure network within development zonings in reality and perpetuity, and also where the funding actually comes from for the council to purchase these areas. Has there's quite a few questions here. Has there been any sort of experiences of backlash to these requirements from developers, especially as an example?
I might work backwards there, Nina, in that I suppose the green infrastructure network, as in the mapped green infrastructure network and the policies supporting it, have been in place in Fingal for 2 cycles of the development plan. So they've been in place for 10 years now, and to a degree, because they were put in 2011, they have perhaps become a bit of they've become part of the furniture. So to a degree, the political buy-in was achieved in 2011. And I suppose the mapping in itself hasn't changed significantly since then. So that it wasn't changed over the course of the last development plan cycle. Politically, there's buy-in for this. And I think now there's even more political buy-in for the type of thing that we're doing in Fingal. So we don't get political pushback that way. Where we do get pushback is at planning application stage, whereby developers particularly might not want to have to all intents and purposes, sterilize a part of their land for the sake of putting in place a riparian strip. And it's having that statutory local level policy that's there for that at the local area plans, which then phases where delivery should occur and why particular things need to be done. That has been particularly useful in setting out what are the requirements, what are the hard requirements that needs to be done. And it provides little wriggle room, but then the trade-off is that they get planning permission for the development of land which might be contiguous with a sensitive site that otherwise they wouldn't get, or it might be fraught with difficulty. I think that I suppose if I might go back to a few points that Max has made to support it, I think there's getting political buy-in now, if you're starting at this point, is a key issue. And I think the graphic explanation of it is a huge part of that. I just took part in the Climate Action Regional Office training for the region over the course of the last 3 to 4 days. And the key issue is trying to translate the science into something that's easily understandable for members of the public or for councillors. And once you get councillor buy-in, to a large degree, one, they're the ones who are going to vote in the strategies, and 2, they're also the explainers who are going to go out to the public. They're the key point of contact, not the planner, not the biodiversity officer. So doing that is a key part of the strategy. I also think the regional level approach would be the best way to do this, in that Fingal County Council has a very strong set of policies, objectives, mapping. But if that doesn't match up with what's taking place in an adjoining local authority, then there's a disjoint that's there that isn't going to allow for an effective rivers don't particularly care about boundaries. So I think that having the approach that Max is espousing at a regional level, and the regional spatial economic strategies can provide for that as well. But having that regional approach, I think, is the way to do it. And finally, I suppose back to the first point in terms of where money should go. If I had the ability to be able to kind of replicate the biodiversity officer and the heritage officer in Fingal County Council, I'd do it 10 times. They're essentially boots on the ground. And what they do is develop the level of knowledge. They're able to winkle out funding. They're able to do this in a way that, because it's their bailiwick, because it's their area of expertise, they then are the influencer within the local authority for, let's say, plans and policies, for finding funding. And they do the job that the planner doesn't do, that the engineer doesn't do, and that the park superintendent doesn't do. So that's where I would put the money.
That's excellent, David. And I think I might pick up on that a little bit, because it was a question I had highlighted for myself in terms of, you talking about Fingal and talking about the cross-border and adjoining authorities and scale. Are you able to expand at all in terms of what is happening on the regional level or even national level elsewhere in the Republic in terms of, is this sort of work getting picked up? And I wonder, Catherine and Max, whether you might be able to expand on that at all in terms of GB, and has there been, obviously we've got the individual approaches, but has there been any ongoing conversations around sort of cross-border work, and whether that has been part of the, I guess, recent developments at all? But if you could start with that, David, do you have anything to say? Sure.
And I suppose one of the issues for local authorities, certainly I find in my experience, is that they really, once you're past their boundaries. It's a case of here be dragons, that there may be little enough interaction with others. So recently what's been set up is the Climate Action Regional Offices. So they are there for each of the regional authorities, and their role and what they drive is, one, the information side of things, the information gathering, and also the attempts to try and provide for mapping at a regional basis. Now they're recently established, and the issue I think for them is that certainly from an Irish perspective, things work better on a personal relationship side of things. So you really need to meet the people, you need to establish the relationship, you need to get the work done. And it has been more difficult during COVID to do that. But I think their brief is really a key part of this, because having the local authorities aligned in a way that they might not otherwise be is a key part to, for example, expanding the terminologies that might be used, what particular areas are of importance, what might be an appropriate level of a buffer associated with particular river typology. These kind of things, I think, are key issues to try and bottom out, so that as quickly as possible, so that all local authorities have the maps and objectives to be able to work towards.
Thanks, David. I wonder, Max and Catherine, would you have anything to say on kind of more regional or even, GB-wide cross-border working?
Well, one of the reasons why we convened that JNCC-led workshop was to sort of stimulate these kind of discussions and to share information. And, I would really encourage the countries to keep being part of that conversation. I hope that, the people that I've listed on the front of my slide can be contacted at any stage to share information. And there's nothing stopping people from meeting at a regular basis to report how they're getting on. But we do have to realize that there are projects already that are working across borders which will contribute to this. For example, we have the River Dee Life project between Wales and England. And yeah, rivers don't respect borders. They're a classic example of where we will have to work with each other. And I think that's a great opportunity and incentive.
Yep, 100%. And what about you, Max, in terms of especially considering who you are kind of partnering with? Has there been any sort of learnings from that or that we could pick up on?
Well, I was going to say that the Glasgow and Clyde Valley Green Network is a regional component of a much larger Central Scotland Green Network, and that Central Scotland Green Network is a national development in our Scottish National Planning Framework. And so in a way, the development of our blueprint in the Glasgow region has been a test bed for rolling out that approach across the whole of Central Scotland. So other regional components of the Central Scotland Green Network are looking to replicate the approach that we've developed in the Glasgow region. But that is only part of a much larger discussion about the merits of having a national ecological network across the whole of Scotland. And that's been debated for quite a while. There have been moves to try and get that embedded within our national planning framework as a national development as well. In other words, the highest level of kind of strategic delivery. And that debate is ongoing, and how you might actually represent these ecological networks, whether it's national or otherwise, is still kind of in flux, I think. Perhaps we have the model, but as Catherine said, there are other people doing similar things, and maybe it doesn't need to be one size that fits all. So I think that there is potential for these approaches to be rolled out. Certainly they are being rolled out across Central Scotland, but they could be rolled out more generally using similar or the same approach. As far as cross-border, in other words, from Scotland into England, I'm not aware of that, but there are partnerships like the Tweed Forum that operates in the south of Scotland, but the Tweed catchment stretches, as Catherine was saying, is no respecter of international country boundaries. And part of the Tweed catchment is in Northumberland in England as well. And so there's an example of a kind of a cross-boundary initiative, but it's based on a catchment. And perhaps I've talked about regional, but perhaps it's catchment level, I don't know. But I think those are the kind of scales that seem to work, and naturally then we will see discussions going across whether they are local authority boundaries or country boundaries, I think, in order to stitch together these networks.
Yeah, thanks.
And it's worth mentioning the marine environment specifically too. So,
yeah.
It just makes sense. Such large ecosystems are international.
That's a very, very good point, Catherine, 100%. I just thought I might read this out. There was a comment from Bruce Wilson that the National Ecological Network is a unfulfilled commitment in the now expired Scottish Biodiversity Strategy for 2020. Just for context. I wonder if I can keep at you, Max, and read out this question from Anne-Marie McDevitt. You mentioned different streams in the habitat network. You were talking about the climate forests, your peatland, grassland, and water catchment sort of initiatives. How do you determine priorities, given that there may be potential conflicts between, for example, maintaining existing species-rich grasslands and expanding native tree planting and so on? Has that sort of thinking or strategies being put in place yet?
Well, yes, of course. I think when you start representing these different habitat networks at a regional level, as we have done, clearly some of the networks overlap one another, and there is potential therefore for conflict. But I think actually in practice, when you drill right down to making decisions on the ground about where you need an intervention in order to stitch together one habitat network or the other habitat network, these things do resolve themselves. And for example, there will be no intention to knit together broadleaf woodland habitat networks by planting trees on peatland. That's a rule. That is a given. That's not negotiable.
Yeah.
But there might be situations where we want to plant a new native woodland to stitch together a native woodland network, which might fall upon neutral grassland habitat. Well, I think what we would say is that isn't the right solution. That isn't the right solution. Neutral grasslands are very scarce in our area. They've been lost over time through development and agricultural improvement. We wouldn't be thinking about planting trees on those kind of habitats at all. And when you look at the habitat network modeling and the opportunity areas that are identified for habitats, they're not pinpoint. They are areas of opportunity. So that there's always opportunity for actually, through good design, to achieve both, to actually knit together what might on the face of it seem like conflicting uses.
Yeah, and obviously, Catherine, go ahead.
Yeah, I can add to this because there's a really interesting question from Steve Henry, which he's asking about, could archaeological and heritage networks be in NRNs? So moving on from the overlap of habitat maps or whatever, and I think the answer to that is they will be, because when you think of the location of some of those resources like hill forts in mountain areas, or we strongly appreciate the value of archaeological records in wetlands and peatlands, so they will be there. And I think in some ways they could provide us with very important management information in terms of target setting. So now in Wales, we now use paleolimnology as a standard approach to determining, looking at the lake sediments, to determining if a lake is polluted and the history of impacts on that lake. So I think there's a very interesting potential synthesis and advantage to thinking across that gradient from archaeology to heritage into natural history, which is part of our heritage.
Yep, 100%. That's a very interesting point, actually. I'm happy that it was brought up in the questions. Thank you for responding to that, Catherine. Well, this is quite a big one, but I do wonder whether there's views on this, and there's actually something I can even say on this. There was an anonymous question that came through, or really a comment and following with the question. The DERA strategy now is up for renewal. And it must capture what the future could look like, or at least set out how we will get to a functioning connected network to align across government departments and so on. Otherwise, it's going to be, a little bit ad hoc at best. And so obviously, these are the sort of considerations that we need to be making at this point in time. How do we get this spatial planning into councils, and then at a national level where councils can play their part and are financed to promote and deliver under the strategic plans created by DERA? This is maybe something that David can have a little bit of a view on, and I think we've sort of touched upon this already, haven't we? But in terms of, I guess, I can make a very quick comment on what we are planning to do as a project, and this is one of the aspects that we are aiming to tackle as part of producing a couple of case studies. And one of them is exploring, what the role of a local authority could be like, and especially working with the counterparts of David, and how planning would play a role in that. So it's something that we are certainly exploring. But I do wonder, David, whether you would have any views on that, and in case Max and Catherine would have anything to kind of add on top of that at all.
Am I correct? I suppose DERA it's the Department of Agriculture in the UK. Is that what this relates to?
Is Northern Ireland's
okay.
Yes, counterpart.
And I suppose in dealing with the rural area in Fingal, certainly one of the key issues that's arising is the intensification of agriculture and the consequences of that. And I think it's to a degree somewhat uncaptured within planning, the impact of this and the impact of nitrification. Certainly, while it's known how planning controls and impacts upon that is something that, again, feeds back into the point I made earlier on, whereby while Fingal County Council can have, can have green infrastructural maps or networks, and ours does include archaeological sites, actually, just while I'm at it, that to a degree might provide some level of indication as to what's required in particular lands. So for example, buffer zones that will be associated with riverine systems. There's also nature development areas where, for example, there's acknowledged areas of high biodiversity, for example, or areas where where habitat has been identified as being useful for a particular species. But again, that's maybe a patchwork side of things. I think it's really at a regional level that this comes back to something that's been implemented, that will be determined, agreed, and then implemented, so that each local authority knows what they're doing and has buy-in, and so that the farmers that might be in one local authority area don't consider that they're being unnecessarily burdened, or that they're having to deal with something that another local authority area aren't. So I think that will be where I would push that at, is at the regional side of things. That it would have to be dealt with, because it is a very significant issue.
I think that that goes quite nicely back to Bruce's recent question as well. And he says, I have been wrestling with trying to align accurate environment and climate schemes with ecological network creation and design at scale, but there seems to be quite a lot of government resistance on that. Are there any sort of views on tackling this? Without this alignment, really, there isn't, without the alignment, it will be hard to do anything meaningful, and even harder leverage, I'm assuming, additional private sector funding. And I guess that comes back to, you know, that kind of cross-cutting sort of approach that we're all talking about when it comes to whether we call nature recovery networks or ecological networks or green infrastructure networks, whether we just talk about it within planning itself, but also more widely. How do we make sure that we integrate this sort of thinking across government policy, so we can link, you know, we have a climate crisis and we have an ecological crisis, and they are obviously interlinked and intertwined, and you could potentially, you know, be able to tackle both of these, you know, with appropriate action. So I wonder whether there are any views on how you would tackle this. At the same time, I guess, an opportunity for integration, but also the mountain that you need to climb to get there. It's a big question, but I wonder whether you would have any comments, any of you, on that.
Yeah, I'll just jump in there. I suspect Bruce engages with Scottish Government in the way that I don't. So, you know, I'm not aware of the huge government resistance that he mentions in his question, and it might exist, I don't know. But if there is government resistance, I suspect it's because they think that this kind of thinking should be done at a more local level, not at a national level. And that is why they've talked about having regional spatial strategies, which in my opinion should include ecological networks, along with all the other kind of things they're thinking about in terms of development. And that the agri-environment schemes, which are obviously in flux at the moment because of Brexit, but, you know, they should be supporting delivery of these regional ecological networks, and that at a national level, it's just it's a question of ensuring that those regional networks connect together cross boundary. I mean, I think that's the way I see it. You know, I don't operate at that kind of level of engagement, which I think Bruce does, but that's the way I see it working in Scotland. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for that. Would you have anything to say, David or Catherine? I think, David, you sort of have your hand up.
Yes, I think, I suppose, in Ireland at the moment, the Climate Action Bill is wending its way through Parliament, and that is going to require, I suppose, it requires a level of integrated government level thinking at all levels. But I think that one of the issues is going to be ownership. So, for example, with what's set out in legislation as a requirement, and there's already legislation regarding this in Ireland, it's actually where it's implemented and the level that it's implemented at is going to be the key feature. And it does really come back to my point, I feel, to an extent, like I'm saying the same thing, but you know, at local level is where things are implemented, but local level, in my opinion, clearly isn't a strategic enough level for these things to be done at. And I think that it's at regional level that those decisions need to be made, so that they're owned then by the local authority who've participated in it. Whereas if it's directed at governmental level without a and decided at that level, again, it may take longer for it to filter down to the local authorities in order for it to be implemented. Whereas if they're doing it, if they're part of the participation process at regional level, it'll be undertaken more quickly. That will be my key thinking on it here. From the, I suppose, within the Republic, certainly the message that seems to be coming out of government from all levels is that there is a huge crisis and that we have 9 years to resolve this. And so there's certainly that messaging, but that is, to a degree, high-level messaging. It's at the implementation level it will occur, and I think that it's doing that at regional level so that it has the scale, the size, and the buy-in to be done. That's where the implementation will happen.
Yeah, I don't mind you repeating. I think it is something that we all keep on coming back to, isn't it? You know, what is the appropriate scale? If we talk about the actual practicalities and buying. So I think it's very relevant what you've just said, you know, how we can't go too small, but we can't go too big, other than look, with the overarching kind of themes and messaging. But it's really the sort of regional level that we think I'm gathering within this team here. Is that appropriate? There's enough scale to start delivering meaningful outcomes, but also enough scale to have enough people in kind of one place to actually have that input and that buy-in that is needed for it to work.
It also, if I might add, has a political level of input as well, and that's the way the regional councils work in the Republic, is that there are councillors appointed from each local authority to participate in that. So each local authority, both at the executive and at the elected representative level, has input and I suppose some level of agency in the process.
Yep, thanks for that, David. And I guess that flows quite nicely to Victoria Madrian's question. It was something actually I had highlighted for Max as well. Victoria was directing this to Catherine, but I wonder, Max, whether you would be able to pick up on this as well. Catherine outlined the importance of involving people, nature networks as being as much for people as for nature. How important is it to invest in community engagement and political engagement in the network vision? And I guess that question, Max, I had highlighted for you before today was just the kind of, we talk about partnerships and projects, but what's the kind of role of an individual, whether that is an individual landowner, but also how do we facilitate that when it comes to engagement and designing our vision as well. I guess it's about designing, but also delivery. And I wonder whether, Catherine, you could pick up on that first, and whether Max, you might want to add something onto it.
Well, I think all I can do is reiterate, that it's a new way of thinking we have here now. Nature networks are as much about people as nature. And I think we all realize that if we don't have the people on board, we will not be able to deliver this. Mm-hmm. And going back to your just previous discussion, a lot of it is around having the right people in the right room to try and influence these things, and to have the evidence understandable and accessible to them. And I also think what's coming out of our discussions is very interesting, is around this sort of tension between national scale and local delivery. That is really interesting, and that is a challenge that we need to keep an eye on as things progress. How effective are we going to be in terms of delivering national objectives at a local scale, and how is that going to be tracked and reported on?
Yeah, and that's actually a comment you might see from Paul Larmer just in the Q&A just now as well. How do we kind of effectively market this, and to who and at what level? And
communication is all around consideration of your audience. Natural capital, that language is designed for economists and more government circles. Communication is fundamental from the start, and you're going to have a narrative designed for the different audiences you're going to be talking to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Max, would you have anything to add?
Yeah, I do. Yes, in the comment section earlier on, I think as David was speaking earlier, there was a question about the use of the words nature, green infrastructure network, and ecology, natural networks, and that sort of thing. Whether they're the same thing. And my view is, well, I'm employed to deliver a green network, and that term was coined obviously back in the early 2000s in my region, before green infrastructure had embedded itself into the UK. And I think if it had been launched now, it might be called a green infrastructure network. But anyway, I think of a green network as it being multifunctional. It embraces everything to do with ecological networks, but it's more than just an ecological network. And so if you like, if you were drawing a systems map of a green network, you'd have a big circle for green networks and a smaller circle within it for ecological networks. And so the representation of the blueprint for the green network sort of clearly represents both a people network and an ecological network. That's not to say that they're completely divorced from one another, but clearly there are parts of the ecological network which are well away from the majority of the people who live within our region. And there are parts of urban Glasgow where it'd be very difficult to deliver what might be a purist ecological network. We can introduce nature, of course, but networks is much more difficult in those very hard urban environments. So it's a bringing together of overlapping, but not necessarily completely overlapping agendas, I think. Yeah, I don't know what the other, I was going to make another point. Oh, community engagement, yes, when it, and working with people, yeah, I mean, our region has invested in me and my team for the last 15 years. We are not working for an NGO, we are working for the local authorities, but at that level, the local authorities can afford our 3-person team. I head up that team, but one of my team is a communications officer. And from the very start, we recognized that communications and interpreting what we were talking about for different audiences was going to be important. And I think that has really borne out that actually having somebody with communication skill is really critical to getting things embedded and taken up by different audiences. And then we're moving, as I presented, into a kind of delivery phase now. The Clyde Climate Forest is leading that way, and we're getting significant investment into delivering that project. And that investment is going into boots on the ground. So we will have a community involvement officer going in and working up projects in target areas from the ground up with local communities, but also a landowner engagement officer going out and working with people primarily in the rural areas where we need to see new woodlands created in our target locations as well. So I think that that is the way to translate very top-down thinking into more bottom-up kind of delivery, and recognizing that it's not about parachuting in and dropping things on in particular locations, but actually, although we might have a strategic approach, we need to work with local people and with landowners in order to achieve things.
It's that meeting in the middle, isn't it? That's really the key when it comes to messaging and actual practical delivery as well. I guess there's one last question before we really should start drawing this to a close. And I'm considering that we are working with a concept that is still being developed. I'm not sure whether any of you, probably Catherine would be the most appropriate to direct this to, but I'm not sure whether there really is an answer to this. But there was an anonymous question that came through about whether there is any economic evidence to support nature carving networks delivering for the public purse.
Okay, so yeah, that was a bit like the second part of the first question we had, and I've put 2 links in the chat for everybody, because I think it's really important that we actually just touch on the whole funding issue. And there are 2 particular initiatives I'd like to call your attention to. I'm not an economist or a funding expert, but I do think that you should definitely have a look at the IUCN's peatland program. And in particular, if you look on their website, you will see their peatland code. So if you want to try and sell something, one of the fundamental things you need to do is set a standard. And the peatland work shows how this can be done effectively, because investors will need to have the recognition of particular standard before they'll put their money into a project. If you go to the website, there's a natural capital tab, and it relates, it'll show you a natural capital financing structure that they're pursuing. And I think my understanding is that the financial models generally are based around the future cost of allowing habitats to continue to deteriorate. So that's what's been, that's the sort of message people are trying to communicate. And the other excellent project worth looking at is the 1 billion challenge, Scotland's conservation finance project. But I think we all recognize as communities there's a bit of a chasm between working in nature conservation and working in financial management and investment, and coming up with a scheme that links those two worlds will be a big win.
100%. Max?
Yeah, I think this is a really exciting opportunity at the moment. There's a lot of discussions going on about how we can attract private investment into the kind of things that we're talking about. And certainly Scottish Wildlife Trust and SEPA's efforts on the £1 billion challenge is part of that discussion. And Catherine's talked about this chasm, which does exist, but I think we're beginning to build the bridges between the two parties. But it's very, very early days. In our region, we are also at the point of launching a climate adaptation strategy, and that recognizes the role of nature-based solutions in preparing us for a changing climate, and talks about the opportunities for green investment. And that touches upon all sorts of things, not least things like nature-based solutions for flood mitigation and all the rest of it. So there's huge opportunities. One of the things I guess I'm learning as a non-economist, but tuning into all these discussions, is that small projects are not of interest. You've got to have big ideas and big plans at scale. So this comes back to our discussion about whether we should be operating at a local level or at a national level or at a regional level. One of the things we need to think about is being ambitious. We've got to have big plans, because that's the only way we're going to start to attract new and potentially large amounts of money coming into investing into nature recovery for the kind of benefits that will deliver in terms of insurance, in terms of sustaining water quality, and everything else that we get in terms of ecosystem services. So thinking at a project level or a local level is not big enough thinking. We've got to think big, and we've got to put price tags on the cost of that delivery. And yes, we have to start estimating the potential returns on that investment.
Thanks a lot for that, Max. David?
Just, I suppose.
Can you be quick, please?
Yeah, just one final point, I suppose, is perhaps the cost of not doing it. In that, again, strategic environmental assessment of statutory plans is a key aspect of this too. And where you're looking at proposals, for example, to intensify brownfield development, as I mentioned, around public transport, the environmental aspects of that are taken into account. Where you have nature recovery networks, which might be there as part of mitigation strategies that I suppose are already in place or have been developed to be resilient, then the SCA would reflect that. Whereas the other way of looking at it might be that development could be screened out as being inappropriate as a consequence of not having these things in place. And that will be an inappropriate use of funding, especially investment in public transport, where you're not able to develop on brownfield land proximate to public transport networks.
Very relevant point. Thanks for that. I think we will try to draw this to a close now. So we are only going to be a few minutes behind schedule, which I think it's pretty good going. I'm just going to put my last slide on, hopefully, to conclude. So I think that was a fantastic session and fantastic conversation. So thank you so much, obviously, to our excellent panel and your willingness to give us your time and brain power. And thank you, obviously, for everybody who's been asking questions in the Q&A, because that was extremely useful. I think it has given us a lot of food for thought. There was a request, I think, in the chat whether we could share a lot of those links that have been shared. So Laura and Monica, if we can stay on a little bit afterwards as soon as everybody else has gone, we can have a look at how we can do that before we stop the actual webinar. So we'll definitely try to see whether we could facilitate that. At least I do definitely have access to all of Catherine's links, so that should not be a problem. I guess just to conclude, a huge thank you obviously for everybody on the call today. In terms of, I guess, steps going forward, obviously we have our last session next week, which is all about mapping, which obviously we've continuously sort of touched upon. Beyond that, we do keep the Slido link, should still be available for an hour. So if you had any later thoughts, you can keep on going and adding those in. I think that was a very useful exercise, in fact. And also there will be a feedback form that we will be sharing after this. But in case you are attending more than one session, you only really need to fill it in that once, unless there was any burning issues you would like to highlight for us ahead of next week's session. Obviously, we've talked a lot about, you know, working together and what's the appropriate scale and all that. So I thought it would be worthwhile for me to really put that question out there in terms of, do you feel like you or your organization could play a role in delivering nature recovery networks in Northern Ireland? If you do feel like so, obviously at this point in time, the most relevant kind of question would be, would you maybe even have data that you could make available for mapping? But if you do feel like you would like to get involved and you potentially might have data for us for our mapping, because I do get in touch, obviously my contact details are there. And just lastly, obviously a huge thanks goes to HLF, our funder, because without them, we wouldn't be here today and having these conversations and ability to build up this capacity for hopefully having nature recovery networks as a thing of the future of Northern Ireland. So thank you very much for that. And obviously, it's not just on behalf of me, but all the partners. I'm just the lucky one to be the face. So obviously, there's a lot more people working behind the scenes, including Monica and Laura today, who've been doing an excellent job with the chat and helping everybody out. So thank you to them as well. I think we will leave it at that. And obviously, if you haven't signed up for next week, do so if you feel it relevant, and also share that link with any of your networks that you might consider might find that useful. I think that was fantastic, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and I hope to see you all again next week at our last and third session.
Thank you, Nina.
Thank you. And Laura and Monica, if you can stay on, we can have a chat.
Bye-bye.
Chat. Thanks so much, David. Thanks so much, Catherine. That was fantastic. I really appreciate it.
Okay, we'll talk again.
Certainly will.
Bye.